Hello, guys, and welcome to this week's edition of the Internet Weather. So first up, we have the top 10 most broke ports. As you know, we measure the traffic volume in terms of scanning activity on the Internet. And one of the ways we do that is by looking at the different ports that are getting scanned by other people out there, just to understand what kind of things are happening on the Internet that are up and popping. And this week's top 10 are actually pretty much the same top 10 that we see every week. The top 10 most broke ports is generally by volume. But the one port I always highlight every time I'm on is port 445 TCP. And today I even have a little special story of something that I discovered. So checking our activity on port 445 TCP, you guys know that every time I'm on, I kind of like to look at the last 900 days of activity on this port. And so here for April 23rd, what we see is, I guess April 23rd of 2019 is when I first started doing that. So that was almost a year ago now. I kind of started preparing these slides. And back then, what we noticed is that there were a lot of IP addresses scanning the Internet. But going back to 2017, there were only 10,000. And over time, this thing came out called WannaCry. It was using the Eternal Blue exploit, and lots of devices became infected. So if you look at this chart, you'll see there was lots of activity happening, from, I guess, around May of 2017 all the way through like August or June of 2018. And then the activity started trending down. Today, at the end, when I show you all of the slides, I actually have a little bit of a story that's going to take us back to what was maybe happening a while ago that is still happening. Okay, so like I said, every month that I'm on, we kind of look at it. So just looking ahead a little bit, I've been tracking how many IP addresses are responsible for doing the scanning activity. And as we progress through the different months that we've been tracking this, we can actually see the activity is going down and down, sometimes staying the same and going down. And there's not really a good way to take care of this botnet for everyone, or this threat, this worm for everyone, but being able to track how many victims there still are is kind of a good understanding of, is this threat still expanding or is it kind of contracting? In a way, it's kind of similar to the peak that we might be experiencing, or different countries were experiencing with the coronavirus. So here we have activity for February of this year, and then today the activity, as you could see in March, is still decreasing. So now I want to take us back to the story of something I discovered while looking at our Tar-Pit logs that I thought was interesting. So I want to share with you, and it turned out to be something from back in the day once I looked at it a little bit closer. So we have basically a Tar-Pit, and what it does is it just sees what kind of packets get sent its way. And I noticed something strange. On port 9988 TCP, we had IP addresses from different countries all sending us exe files on that port, just an exe file on that port, which I thought was a little bit strange because there's nothing that I'm aware of that I know that listens on port 9988 TCP expecting to get an exe file and execute it. So this immediately caught my attention, and I wanted to dig into it a little bit further and understand what it was all about. So looking at this port in general, 9988 TCP in the Tar-Pit, and then concentrating on the last 5 years worth of activity and seeing what this activity is, we could see that this activity actually goes all the way back to sometime in 2015. So this activity has been going on for a while. This is going back 5 years for us, so that's just as far back as the data goes, but it's likely that this was happening even before. And if you look at the IP addresses that are causing this, they're kind of all over the place. There's no rhyme or reason. But if you look at one individual IP address, you'll see that it's not just activity on port 9988 TCP. There's also activity on port 445 TCP that is like a precursor activity. There's something that happens a few seconds before the IP will send you a packet, which I think is an exploit attempt on port 445 TCP. And then a little while later, a few seconds later, it'll actually send you this exe file on port 9988 TCP. So that actually helps to understand the story a little bit more. So looking at that SMB packet a little bit more, you could see that sandwiched between the A's and the B's in that packet is actually some kind of shellcode that it probably is the one that's responsible for opening up this connection on 988 TCP. So looking at the target and looking at all of the exe files that we've ever received, taking the MD5 SHA hash of the exe files, you could see that for every IP address pretty much, the hash is different. So it's a different hash every single time, which indicates that whatever this exe is, it's some sort of a polymorphic exe. It's basically a worm that's changing for each installation. It's probably there to make sure it doesn't get detected. So I was going to go ahead and reverse engineer this exploit and reverse engineer these exe files. But then I said, wait, before I do that, let's reach out to some people who maybe have a little bit more experience with it. And actually, our friends at Alien Vault Labs, Chris Dolman and Tom Hagel, helped me figure this out a little bit more. So with some Googling around and in general, just some background knowledge, they pointed me at this threat from I guess 2006 or something, which for the internet is like, we'll say back in the day, which is quite some time ago, like 14 years or more, definitely when I was still starting out in computer security. And basically this threat, if you read the descriptions of it, it's a polymorphic worm, like we were able to see, and it spreads through a vulnerability in SMB MS0604-040. So back then, I think the CVE system hadn't been as widely adopted as it is now. So I remember Microsoft was mostly going by their bulletins. In any case, what was this threat? So this was actually a really interesting story. Apparently, there was this person in Estonia who got into a car accident, and his I guess car insurance company, didn't pay out the claim the way he felt like it should be paid out, and he created this worm to spread on port 445 TCP and send this backdoor. And all it did really, besides spreading and worming through the internet, was to create a DDoS attack against websites in Estonia, specifically the website of this insurance company. So this person was actually prosecuted, discovered and prosecuted, and actually served, I think, maybe 2 to 3 years, I don't remember exactly, in jail, and was also ordered to pay restitution amounting to more than $500,000, I believe, in US dollars for the ISP and for that, I think, the insurance company as well. So really interesting story. What was interesting about it for me is that, we still see this activity happening on port 445 TCP. This was something, that was a dispute between this man and this insurance company all the way back in like 2006. And all these years later, like 14 years later, there's still remnants. It's not a lot, but a few PCs here and there scanning on port 445 TCP, looking for this really, really old and ancient vulnerability and trying to infect devices with this worm still to attack, this Estonian insurance company. So just a really interesting story there. All right. So now we'll go to the top 10 most sources probing report. And this is the report that helps us to understand if there's any botnet or worm-like activity. And again, looking at the top 10 most sources probing in this week's report, all of the ports we've generally covered. They are pretty much the same ports that we see week in and week out. So what I decided to do is I decided to look at the next 10, or the, so to speak, the top 20 most sources probing, and see if there's something interesting there. So looking at it, I could see that this port, just because of its length, really spoke to me, which was port 52 869, so 52,869 TCP. This is a port we've actually covered many times on ThreatTraq back in 2018 when it first became, I think, popular, and I think it's been covered widely in general. So I'll explain to you kind of what we're seeing today. So this next chart here shows us basically the scan probe volume on port 52,869, and you could see that the top part of the chart, this is how much scanning in general is happening on this port. And the bottom part of the chart, you could see, is the number of IP addresses doing the scanning. So the top chart, I think, is millions of connections per hour. So you could see that more recently is about 20 million or so connections per hour in general. And then the bottom chart is in thousands. So you could see that probably since November of last year till today, we have, between, looks like 3,000 and 5,000 devices at any given point in time scanning. So usually what I do with these devices is I take them and I try to figure out, well, where are they? What are they doing? Where are they out of? And if you do that and you map it on a map, these are about 5,500 IP addresses that we're scanning in the last 6 hours. Just taking them and mapping them out, you see something interesting. You see that the devices, especially there's seems to be many in China and other parts of Southeast Asia there. There seems to be quite a bit of devices doing the scanning. There's also a heavy concentration in, looks like, Brazil and other parts of South America, definitely Europe. And I would say a pretty heavy concentration than what we normally see in the U.S. as well. Of scanning, and some also in Mexico. So this is a pretty unique scanning profile. If you compare it to other botnets, they look a little bit different. You might see more of a hotspot in India or something like that. So whatever this botnet is that's scanning on this specific port, the devices do seem to be global, but they do seem to have hotspots as well. They're not like everywhere necessarily. Looking at this port or thinking about this port, I wanted to explore what do we see in general in our honeypot looking at the last 60 days. And you could see there's not many events. And if you look at the type of packets we get, it's kind of all over the place. Most of it is HTTP, which is related to a well-known vulnerability that I'll discuss next. But a lot of it is just general scanning, or other unknown protocols that are out there. So people just trying to scan and see what is available on the port. So looking at it in the last 5 years and understanding what is this vulnerability that we covered in 2018, it's actually a vulnerability from 2014. And it's a vulnerability that targets these Realtek devices. I forget it. I think they're like maybe cameras or routers. Basically, they have a UPnP interface that works over the SOAP messaging protocol. And somewhere in that communication, there's an opportunity to inject a command. So if you search the honeypot logs for the presence of this one term, you could see that there's actually, over the last 5 years, we've seen 2 different ports being targeted for this vulnerability. One in the port that we're describing, which is 52,869, and the second is port 49,152. Both of these ports are kind of like out there, they're like these high ephemeral looking ports, but happen to be, I guess, the management ports where the service runs for these types of devices. And you could see, we have activity going back to at least 2016, mid or early 2016, all the way through now. And again, it's not a ton of activity. It's a few devices here or there, but it does show you the length and scope of how long people have known about this. So even though it was generally written about in 2018, you could see people were really interested about in 2016. You could see this vulnerability in general has been known about since at least 2014. So what are some of the other interesting parameters about this botnet? Just looking at the URI patterns of where the malicious activity is trying to reach out on the device, you could see there's different URIs that are being used. And they've been being used since different points in time, but even till this day. And then the user agent string is another thing that usually gets transmitted when you're communicating over the HTTP protocol. And you could see that a lot of the devices that are doing the scanning, they have the hello world user agent string. But one of the user agent strings that kind of spoke to me was Katashi, and it's I believe it's a Japanese word that might mean digit, but Japanese words in the botnet world actually are meaningful because Mirai, which is a very well-known DVR botnet, or IoT botnet, is also a Japanese word. So it made me think, is there a botnet named Katashi? And I found this article back from 2018 as well that actually references a botnet made up of 18,000 devices. There's the Katashi botnet, which is a Mirai variant, and you could see traces of it here in July of 2018 within our Honeypot here. But you could see that it's basically not, it wasn't maybe as big and at least measurably in the Honeypot as maybe it was reported back then. At the same time, some of these things like the Hello World variant of it is still kind of going strong to this day. And kind of we do see in the Honeypot a little bit more frequently. So I hope you enjoyed these stories that basically describe the state of the internet weather today.